Hello, everyone, and welcome to Power Players Fueling Latin America's Future. My name is Luana Lima, and I'm the Associate Director for Educational Programs at the Duke University Energy Initiative, as well as a faculty member at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. For those who don't know, the Duke University Energy Initiative is Duke's interdisciplinary hub for all things energy related. We reach across business, engineering, environment, law, policy, and the arts and science at Duke to educate tomorrow's energy innovators, develop new solutions to research, and improve energy decisions by engaging business and government leaders. You can learn more about us and what we do at energy.duke.edu. This event is also co-sponsored by Duke's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, or CLACS, and we'd like to thank them for their support. You can learn more about CLACS at latinamericancaribbean.duke.edu. We are pleased to partner with them today and to recognize the important role of humanities-based scholarship in the interdisciplinary energy community at Duke University. Regarding logistics for today's event, please feel free to use the Q&A function to indicate you have technical difficulties, and an EI staff member will be glad to help you. Speakers will not be watching or responding to the Q&A during the initial panel discussion, but you can submit questions via Q&A for that segment of the event. An Energy Initiative staffer will be reviewing and sharing questions with panelists at that time. Please note that we'll be recording today's event and sharing it online later. Now that we've gotten that business out of the way, I'm delighted to have the honor of introducing our speakers today. First up is Dr. Christine Folch. Dr. Folch serves as Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Duke University and holds a secondary appointment as Assistant Professor of Environmental Science and Policy as well. She received her PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the City University of New York and her BA in History from Harvard. Prior to teaching at Duke, Folch served on the faculty of Wheaton College, Illinois. Her first book, Hydropolitics, the Itaipu Dam, Sovereign and the Engineering of Modern South America, Princeton University Press, is an in-depth look at the people and institutions connected with the Itaipu Dam, the world's biggest producer of renewable energy on the Paraná River border of Brazil and Paraguay. If you are interested in purchasing your own copy of Hydropolitics, we are glad to inform that Princeton University Press has offered a special discount code that you can use anytime in the month of July. Information is in the chat box. I already have my copy. Next up, we have Duke alumna Dr. Stephanie Fried, who is a cultural anthropologist currently working as a teacher scholar postdoctoral fellow in the Wake Forest University Department of Engineering. Her scholarship and teaching are located at the intersection of science and technology studies, environmental humanities, and the politics of energy and infrastructure development in Latin America. In her book manuscript, Atmospheric Pressure, an ethnography of wind turbines and Zapotec life in southern Mexico, Fried explores the politics of renewable energy in southern Mexico, which have led to huge profits for some, largely at the expense of Oaxaca indigenous Zapotec people. Her research seeks to complicate narratives promising technological fixes alone can solve the complex problems emerging from the burning of fossil fuels. Fried's work is motivated by the conviction that long-term interdisciplinary research can help the world address global climate change. She received her PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University in May 2018. And last, but certainly not least, we have Duke alumna Odette Rouvet, who is a Paris-based public policy specialist on energy, environment, and climate change issues. A Mexican born in Cancun, Rouvet has spent much of her last decade working on environmental issues in Latin America and the Caribbean through positions in government, international organization, and as a private sector consultant. Juve earned a master's degree in Internal Development Policy from the Duke Center for International Development at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. As a Duke student, she was an International Rotary Peace Fellow, developing skills in conflict analysis, negotiation, and mediation. She also collaborated with Dr. Christine Folch on research concerning the Itaipu Dam in Paraguay and Brazil, including opportunities and challenges for regional collaboration on energy, sustainability, development, and climate change issues. Juve earned a bachelor's degree in political science from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. Christine, I will now pass the mic along to you. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. I want to say, first of all, I just want to say thanks to the Duke Energy Initiative for ringleading this. And I want to thank Duke Clacks for saying yes and being part of it as well. I'm really thankful for these two parts of Duke. I'm thankful for Duke in general, but these two really interdisciplinary creative parts of Duke that have been so key in fostering really interesting research. And I thank them for their partnership in some of the work that I'm going to share. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to open a conversation with some rising energy experts on Latin America. And I want to also root the conversation in some practical case study. But so you're going to see me moving between theory and stuff that's quite rooted on the ground, sometimes quite literally. And I think my hope is to open a conversation rather than just to give simple, straight, sort of simple answers. And my underlying thesis, because I'm an academic and of course I'm going to give a thesis, my underlying thesis is that our political and economic categories in the North Atlantic world are marked are based on unmarked assumptions about fossil fuels as the source of electrification and industrialization. And so I'm going to unpack what I mean by that throughout my short presentation. But this sort of unstated assumption that economies work based on and governments are built from fossil fuels, from coal, natural gas, and petroleum, is challenged in a world that is confronting anthropogenic climate change, peak oil, and a general push to renewables. So we're going to see, I offer that we would see our assumptions of what we can expect from politics and economics to be challenged and up for grabs. So I'm going to open with a puzzle, and I'm going to try to share my screen. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and in my cultural anthropology classes, I tell my students, so what we do is we take the familiar and make it foreign, and we take the foreign and make it familiar to end up noticing the world around us, so that things that seemed unremarkable are suddenly come into view. And I'm going to do that with a puzzle. So in the United States, we get nearly 2/3 of the electricity we generate from fossil fuels. And this majority reliance upon fossil fuels for electricity generation is common the world over. 2/3, 3/4 in the Middle East, almost 100% of the electricity is generated from fossil fuels. And these are numbers from the Department of Energy. This is their most recent International Energy Outlook for 2017, but these numbers are pretty stable and have been pretty stable for the last 15 years. There is one exception to this majority reliance upon fossil fuels for electricity generation, and that is Latin America. So in Central and South America, 2/3 of the electricity is generated from renewables, chiefly hydro, but from renewables in general. And so this raises the question, how does it matter to politics and economics if most Or in the case of the country that I know best in South America, Paraguay, all of the electricity is renewable. All of it comes from hydro. What does this help us see about fossil fuels? So my book, Hydropolitics, which is available with Princeton University Press, and shout out to them, explores the question of how does it matter to politics and economics that the source of electrification in South America in general, and particularly the case that I'm interested in is the world's largest hydroelectric dam, how does it matter that industry and electrification in general come from renewable sources rather than fossil fuels? So I want to explore a little bit of how it matters. And so here I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by hydropolitics. So my argument is that materiality matters. So this is me being theoretical at this point, right? So materiality matters. It matters if it's coal versus water. It matters to politics and economics and social values that the energy that fuels industrialization in Latin America, Central and South America comes from renewables predominantly. And so I think there's some important distinctions between fossil fuels and water that we need to tease out to see how materiality matters to politics and economics. So first of all, and this is possibly the most obvious, water has other, arguably more important uses than energy extraction. Which is unlike fossil fuels. So water is obviously used for agriculture, we use it for hygiene, it's even used in industrial processes, but fundamentally we drink it. We have to have it. Secondly, there's this really interesting temporality between production and consumption in hydroelectricity. So unlike fossil fuels, you can't really store hydroelectricity. Batteries are just not efficient at this point, so it has to be consumed the instant it is generated, meaning that there's this constant coordination of supply and demand. So third, there's also, in addition to this temporality of production and consumption, there's this really interesting spatial relationship between supply and demand. So places of consumption and places of generation are linked through permanent high tension power lines. You can't just sort of change the destination for your electricity if you kind of don't like the market price. There's something built, not just in terms of production and consumption, but the connection between the two. And fourth, I want to talk about our notions of property and ownership. So in the United States, if you own a piece of land, you own the subsoil underneath. Maybe you've seen like Beverly Hillbillies, where if you shoot the ground and oil comes up, you get rich. So you own the mineral wealth underneath. This is not the case actually across the world, and certainly not in Latin America. In Latin America, the legal structure is that the subsoil is not privately owned. The topsoil can be owned by you, but the subsoil actually belongs to the nation. And the nation, and therefore the representative of the nation, which is the state, has the mandate to steward the resources of the nation. So what does this mean? This means that hydropolitics, the politics that gets connected, and the political economy that gets connected to water, it signifies integration. Integration between regions in a country, and in the case of what I'm really interested in, between different countries. And since we're talking about integration, politics, culture, sociology, history, diplomacy, law are a part of electricity from the very beginning, not sort of something to consider after other feasibility studies. The next sort of implication of this is that hydropolitics, the politics that gets connected to water, it's meant in the past an expectation of state involvement, pretty heavy state involvement in terms and expectations of development. So I want to talk about what this means in terms of Itaipu Dam, and I'm going to share my screen again. So I'm interested in what this looks like with a very particular case. And so I'm going to give you just a little bit about Itaipu Dam, my research there, and what we've been doing at Duke. So Itaipu Dam is a massive binational dam on the Paraná River border between Paraguay and Brazil. It's governed by a treaty that was signed in 1973, and which is up for renegotiation at its 50th anniversary, which is quite soon. Construction lasted for nearly 2 decades until 1992. It's got an installed capacity of 14,000 megawatts, 20 turbines rated at 700 megawatts. 10 belong to Paraguay, 10 belong to Brazil. So I shadowed the engineers of this dam on the Paraguayan side as part of my research for my book. And I came to realize that the engineers understand that energy engineering is not just a matter of physics, but actually a matter of politics. The engineers themselves understand this. In most years, Itaipu generates somewhere between 90 and 95,000 gigawatt hours a year. This is enough to power a third of the state of California or 7 North Carolinas. But 2019, 2020 has been an aberration in many ways, and the flow is a little lower this year. Some things I think that are interesting about this is that, so the electricity in this dam is not consumed equally between the two countries. Paraguay's half is enough to power 3 Paraguays, so it actually exports a lot of it to Brazil. And since this is governed with a treaty, treaties are political objects, implying consensus between many parts of the population because they have to be passed through Congress. This is up for revision or renegotiation in 2023. And here at Duke, we've been working on analyzing these upcoming negotiations. One of the fundamental tools we're bringing to it from negotiation theory is a distinction between interests and positions. Positions are more superficial and interests are harder to get at, harder to study, harder to see, but they move positions. And so what we are suggesting in our findings is that there's a need to refocus at least, the integration questions in Itaipu, if not beyond Itaipu, to focus integration questions in the region, not just on political positions that depend upon sort of ideological similarities between governments, but interests which are harder to get at, harder to study, but much more long-lasting. And so if you're interested in reading more about this, I would send you to our website, Itaipu Post 2023. It's got paywall-free access to publications, and you can read more about what we're doing there. So that's my quick presentation. I now want to yield the floor to Stephanie Freed, who has, an interesting perspective to add to this from a different part of Latin America. Thank you very much.
I'm thrilled to be here. I just wanted to also thank CLACS, who supported me during my graduate training, and the Center for the Energy Initiative at Duke, which was just getting underway when I was spending my time there. So I'm going to bring into view another case study, and I'm going to just pull up my slides. So you should be able to see a map of Mexico. And this is in southern Mexico on the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is usually where I find myself on the steamy late June days of June. This narrow neck of land was where I spent more than 18 months conducting field work between 2011 and 2016. The Isthmus also happens to be one of the windiest places in the world. Powerful gusts of air are transferred from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. And this is home to what investors now call the Isthmus Wind Corridor Mega Project, composed of around 23 different wind farms consisting of an estimated 1,700 wind turbines, each owned by a different company. The discounted electricity that is being produced isn't for public consumption, but rather is sold to large companies to power their manufacturing facilities elsewhere in the country. The Isthmus Wind Corridor Project encircles the city of Juchitán de Zaragoza, a city that is home to more than 100,000 people, the majority of whom identify as indigenous Zapotec people. The project was initially sold as a win-win solution to address both climate change and poverty at the same time. However, beginning as early as 2011, when the projects were just getting underway, they became a source of conflict. The majority of the benefits from the projects, like carbon reduction, affordable electricity, carbon credits, and profit, were being sent elsewhere. The benefits that did stay local, like short-term employment on construction jobs or rental payments for leasing land, They were being distributed unevenly and exacerbating already existent and latent tensions in the region, tearing at the region's already delicate social fabric. And so while I had gone there initially to study the conflict over these wind farms, which had become a relative, I mean, in the wind energy circle, which is relatively might be small, but it kind of drew a lot of attention. But while I was there, I became fascinated by something else. I wanted to know what, just following on Christine's work, what is the quality that makes wind energy different from other forms of energy? What makes wind energy unique? And does this force engender particular kinds of social and political possibility that other forms of energy might not? So, as you can see, the Isthmus is a region filled with wind turbines, and it is also quite windy. So one night I was at a community meeting, and one supporter of wind energy who stood to gain quite a bit of money should the proposed wind farm be built, made a striking statement. 10 years ago, the wind bothered us. We had to close our mouths so the force of the air didn't fill them with dust. Not anymore. Gracias a Dios for placing us here at this time in history so that we can finally benefit from the winds which have bothered us for so long. These comments are revealing in both obvious and not so obvious ways. The wind, like most other natural resources, isn't just energy. It needs to be transformed before it can become power, be it electrical, economic, or political. So in order to turn the wind into power, policies, people, and technology all need to align to turn gales into currents. So late afternoon, Mexico City, I'm at a conference on renewable energy futures, and one speaker turns to the screen behind him to point at the map you see in front of you. Building a wind farm in Oaxaca is like playing darts, he said. You always get a bullseye. Get used to this image. You're going to be seeing a lot of it. This is the Wind Energy Resource Atlas of Oaxaca, where most stories of the country's wind energy industry begin. After nearly a decade of study about the direction and speed of the winds in Oaxaca, the efforts to map its force were completed. The resource, and all of the wind was rated according to resource potential. So 1 was on the scale was relatively low, with 7 being more than excellent resource potential. And experts all agreed that this atlas was the major trigger for financial investment in Oaxaca's wind. Winds that were legible on the atlas became resource potential, translating the particular into the universally recognizable idiom of resource potential. Maps are visual tools with a long history of rendering invisible the political work that has gone into their production. And so this image is making an argument. That is, it's disentangling the winds from the complex social and political landscapes over which it must traverse in order to exist. So late one evening, I sat with the head engineer of one of the region's largest wind farms, who was recalling the early days of his work down on the Isthmus. When the wind farms first went online, he said the turbines were failing all the time. We thought it was the manufacturers, that the machines weren't any good. But as time went on, you see the wind at our site, we realized it was really complicated. So we don't think of wind as being complicated, but what he went on to explain was that the initial models didn't give the whole picture, that the wind here, he was explaining, at their site was very turbulent. Turbulent wind, he went on, wears down turbines, increasing the needs for repair and therefore the cost of electricity being produced. So the growth of the wind energy industry in southern Mexico hinged on the atlas's capacity to transform turbulent winds into something static, upon which estimates about future profit could be modeled. As information on a map, the wind is stripped of its wildness. The representational logic of the atlas, while making the wind visible for a moment, keeps other factors and forces from view. Large-scale megaprojects like renewable energy in Mexico or even hydropower in Paraguay hinge on a logic of equivalence regarding CO2. That is, that CO2 reductions in one place equal CO2 emissions in another. This is similar to assumptions about categorizing wind energy potential and the assumptions undergirding the atlas that I've talked about. The assumption, I think, is that nature or the wind, once turned into numbers, could be open for business. That said, like the turbulence referenced by the engineer at one wind farm, many aspects of the natural world remain untranslatable, and some things cannot be rendered equivalent. So analysis over social conflicts of resource extraction, both in the US and Latin America, often highlight the uneven distribution of profits, as well as the threat these projects pose to people's control over their land and resources. And all of these issues are extremely important. However, today I just wanted to add another layer to this and follow up on what Christine's provided us so far. What is the consequence of rendering something so inherent to place, something so intimate as its weather, and in this case the wind, as a natural resource? What other kinds of erasure must also occur? And how might green energy developers who are committed to this narrative of the win-win solution of sustainable development reconcile the ways in which wind is deeply entangled with the social and topographical landscapes over which it must pass? And attending to these kinds of vulnerabilities, it requires a commitment to understanding the socio-political and historic landscapes of the places where profits are potential. And it's a reminder of the wind's unpredictability and potentially violent strength and force. So I hope that adds another case to all of you, and I'm going to pass it on to Odette.
Today, I'm going to talk to you about energy policy and opportunities for policymaking post-COVID. I would like to first introduce you to what has shaped policy globally. In the 1990s, power sector reform model comprised a package of 4 structural reforms. Regulation to create autonomous regulatory entities to support autonomy, accountability, and transparency. This was a tendency to protect the system from political influence. Restructuring, the corporatization and verticalization of unbundling the utilities. Now, private sector participation, particularly in transmission and distribution, and competition in the wholesale power market. The trajectory in Latin America was the same, but operated under different underlying conditions, and countries in the region have experienced additional challenges. The historical patronage politics and the way pricing of electricity could be used to mobilize the electorate made this rent-seeking behavior challenging to implement the reforms in many countries of the region. Low institutional flexibility to adapt for implementation of reforms in many countries required the right incentives, as well as adaptation of institutions needed to fully implement the reforms. Many countries are still in the phase of building capacity, and institutions have changed and are still in development. Separate regulatory agencies. According to the World Bank, 68% of the Latin American countries have separate regulatory agencies from the government. Despite that, there must be additional efforts towards transparency and overall institutional quality. For example, appointments, administrative issues within the agency, the publication of norms and ethic codes, public financial accounts are still to be seen in many of these countries. Governance of public utilities require more transparency and accountability in Latin America. Now, consistency through time. The power sector reform must be consistent with political system and ideology, capitalized by leadership. Narrative. As Dr. Folch points out in the book, energy policy in Paraguay is characterized by hierarchy values influenced heavily from hydroelectric policy shaping into the political economy and community life. So the narrative in Latin America has been very important to take into policy making. Decarbonization commitments. This is a positive aspect because generally, as Christine has pointed out, in Latin America, there are already efforts and there is already the clean matrix of energy. This is reflected also in the reforms. The incentives for low carbon technologies, the decoupling of subsidies, and encouragement of energy efficiency behavior in consumption and industry. All of this considering that Latin America region has the clean energy matrix, as I mentioned. Now, the adoption of a set of policy instruments, such as supply auctions as part of their clean energy transition. So this is all part of the Latin America perspective. Now, how can we answer or see the panorama with COVID and the policy cycle? The current COVID crisis impacts directly the policy cycle. A new problem definition made by policy analysts will have to be made considering the underlying impacts of COVID. A new setup of priorities in the agenda like health, for example, new financial configuration of the national budget, different setups for implementation as well, additional barriers, more costs. This could potentially be a dangerous window as well, window of opportunity for opportunistic behavior of institutions, for example, in terms of accountability and transparency. Policy legitimation requires stakeholders exchanging, talking, positioning in terms of interest and power. And COVID poses a threat due to the lack of physical exchange and interaction during this time of crisis. COVID is still a major crisis worldwide, and unfortunately, many lives have been lost. But despite all of it, countries still must navigate their agendas. COVID has brought to light what was already visible in Latin America: the unequal access and affordability of energy for many in the region. Most European countries, for example, had the structural and institutional capacity to shift, for example, his workforce to usual labor to remote labor. While in Latin America, this proves challenging because of the large informal economy, and most probably also due to affordability and unequal access of energy, internet, and skills. Remaining the challenges to foster social, inclusive, and economically affordable sustainability energy is yet to be a constant in the region. A renewed spirit of activism and commitment from society has risen in many parts of the world, and LAC is no exception, and should have to be reflected in future policymaking in the region. Folch described very well in her book how students' activism in Paraguay opened the conversation about the dam's impacts into power relationships between Paraguay and Brazil. COVID has opened the door again to new consumer behaviors and business models that disrupt existing value chains and have the power to potentially reshape the economy and the whole energy system. Innovation is already a main point in many of the Latin American countries and development agenda. Nonetheless, financial commitment and cooperation amongst the countries within the region is needed. My message to you today is that the new social dynamics that COVID crisis worldwide can be a window of opportunity in Latin America for the energy sector to encourage the reactivation of national economies. The region can create this as an opportunity to achieve multidisciplinary work in the energy sector while coping with the impacts of COVID. According to the World Bank analysis, on the electricity front, if the current trend is followed, electricity requirements are estimated to increase by 91% by 2040. To put this into context, it will require the equivalent of planning, building, and maintaining 18 new hydropower stations the size of Itaipu. I want to thank this opportunity of interdisciplinary conversation to Duke's Energy Initiative and our sponsors. I believe this type of conversations belong not only in scholarship, but also in government and the private sector. Thank you.
I think we're gonna, so while Odette is coming back, thank you. We wanted to have a quick moment just for conversation between the panelists before opening it up to the sort of larger conversation. And we're going to do this in a little bit less time than originally planned because we chatted a lot, and we want to make sure we save room for our conversation together. So I think I'm just going to toss out a conversation topic that strikes me in terms of listening to, thinking about my presentation and thinking about the work that Stephanie and Audette have presented, work that is about a case study in Mexico, and then work sort of looks at high level questions in terms of patterns across public policy. And I think that one of the questions I have is to think more about the importance of narration and talking about, like, figuring out how to talk about these kinds of energy challenges and energy situations. I was looking at some of the questions from the Q&A that were sort of public, and there was a really good question that was about, like, well, I mean, isn't it technically that water in the reservoir is actually hydroelectricity in storage? Can you say a little bit more about how you can say that you can't store hydroelectricity? And I think that raises for me the question of so one of the challenges that I see in terms of work on energy is that because energy is not just physics, but it is also politics, thinking about how it is that we talk about energy is actually, in some ways, can be as fundamental as thinking about how energy itself can be generated. So politicians can promise things that, you know, engineers are like, that's not possible according to the laws of physics. Right, and there's that challenge, but then there's this also other challenge of when engineers can say, well, this is the situation, blah, 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 and people are like, oh, that seems really important. I don't really understand what a megawatt is or what a megawatt hour is, and what's the difference between, you know, a megawatt and a megawatt hour, which one's energy, etc. And one of the challenges comes in figuring out how to translate energy questions in ways that acknowledge that stakeholders are not only engineers. And so that's one of the things that and yet the importance of understanding, or of the importance of engineering knowledge to these sort of political narratives also is really important. That was a tension I found in my work. You know, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how you sort of navigated that tension, and coming back a little bit more there too.
Well, I'm currently teaching and doing research in an engineering department, but come at it from this perspective of having worked studying engineers. And one of the reasons that I was so interested in studying engineers was that they made that engineering has a cultural value in different countries in different ways. So Christine, in your book, you talk about the ways in which in Paraguay, there was a sort of an opportunity to move into a sort of place of life of the middle class. And similarly in Mexico, the people that are choosing to be renewable energy engineers are choosing that over the vast majority of engineers who are petroleum engineers. So they're really making political, there's an inherently political choice in that decision making in their careers, and therefore, but that then gets silenced from going forward, right? So they don't talk about their career choices in terms of politics. However, the values that drove their decision making were inherently political, right? And so I think that for me, what's really interesting is that work of translating between engineering knowledge and social scientific knowledge and historical knowledge and literary knowledge, it takes time. And I think there's a way for me that I really struggle to find that it's hard to find that kind of time to engage in conversations that require that level of translation. I recently submitted a grant with a colleague of mine to NASA, and we spent days just like trying to understand what the other person was saying. She's an engineer and as well. And I just, in order to get to a shared language, we really had to commit to it, which was something that I think can be quite difficult to find space for. I also think that there's this question of specificity that you were talking about, Christine, in terms of the question and answer. And someone also asked us another question about the mapping of resources like wind. Well, if they mapped more qualities of the wind, wouldn't the map be more accurate and therefore allow financing to be, financiers to be more knowledgeable and the projects to be more successful? And I would argue perhaps, but also like, perhaps not. There's uncertainties, right? And that what I really am trying to get at is that qualities like water that are life-giving, wind, like that it matters that people have lived amongst them, and that we need to take those kind of life-giving, the vitality and the force of those qualities into consideration when we're transforming them. And that can't be, that it's never going to be just this clean break, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So Odette has some technical difficulties, but she is participating in this conversation. I think just one thing I want to switch us to some questions. And I know that there's some questions in the Q&A section, and perhaps Brian has curated some as well. But I think one of the things that has come, one of the things I really appreciate about the dam that I work on, because it's an international object, because it sits on a border, and the reason it sits on a border has to do with some challenging relations in the past between Paraguay and Brazil. So both countries knew that this was not just about electricity. There's a real sense of awareness that there's history and international relations in this project all the way through. And you know, the people who built it were quite aware of those challenges. I think that one of the questions I think that comes up as we talk about energy futures is this tension of, you know, how much do you have to know about the science in order to be able to talk about the politics and the political ramifications of these projects, the economic ramifications of these projects? And I think it's a both and. I think, you know, one of the things that I've been very fortunate to do here at Duke is to be able to work with teams of students, multiple teams of student researchers, both graduate students and undergraduates, and take them on field work visits in South America, to the dam, to stakeholders. And the reality is that, you know, the challenge of engineering is that it's not in a vacuum, it's in a social context. And the social context is, you know, maybe it's even harder to figure out than the physics. And so part of that is really thinking about messaging and narrative. So, and that, you know, it is not something that you can have a simple formula to solve. Not that engineering formulas are simple. So that's sort of from the sort of the field work experience. That's one of the key findings. Brian, should we transition to some of the questions, and you can sort of help us out understanding what, you know, how Odette can be part of this conversation, because I think her points about crisis and are really relevant.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'd sort of like to begin with, you know, a point that sort of took shape for me during Odette's talk, which is this notion of, you know, the importance, as you said, of narrative and messaging in policymaking. And connecting that to the example that Stephanie used in her talk of, you know, the man who stood to profit from wind development in Mexico, who essentially, you know, wanted to persuade people by telling the story of, you know, let's transform our relationship to the wind. And so I guess starting with you, Christine, in Paraguay, as you know, as the government, you know, considers its future with respect to the Itaipu Dam, what sort of stories or what tools do they use to persuade constituents that the decisions they're making about the dam are the right decisions and that they have their stakeholders' interests at heart?
Thank you. So I want to also acknowledge right from the bat that this is a binational dam. So there's a whole other side to it. And the whole other side is Brazil, which is the size of incredibly complicated country. And I want to just situate what I'm talking about from one perspective so that it's, but to really acknowledge that there is another partner, a full partner in this conversation that is super important. I think what I will say in answer to that is that so Paraguay has a GDP of somewhere around 30 billion a year. It's a country that's about the size of California. It has about 7 million people. It has about 14 million cattle, right? It's more cows than people. Just think about it. It's not very populated. It's not very sort of dense. And this dam is its sort of number one resource, like in terms of like its agriculture is obviously huge. But in terms of sort of like concentrated, this dam is a really big deal because it can power a lot of transformation in the country. So people really care about it. This is, I think, one of the benefits, but also challenges of my research project was that basically everybody has an opinion about this in Paraguay. And they use this dam as a way to talk about, so popularly people use this dam as a way to talk about everything, about their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with government, their hopes for the future, what they think about history, etc. It stands in for a lot. And so then what that means is the government has to find ways of narrating energy decisions according to the values of people. And it's a fraught experience because the population is in general not satisfied with how the government has stewarded the resources from the dam for understandable reasons. There's been a dissatisfaction in terms of rent capture. And yet, there's this other relationship that Paraguay has to manage in the dam, which is their relationship with their neighbor Brazil, and major business partner. And I think that the tensions between these two relationships, the relationship between countries and a relationship within a country, is one that is still being worked out.
Should I follow up, or I think let's just go on to the next question. I mean, I have something to say. And if Odette is available.
Love to hear your response, Stephanie.
I just wanted to point out that in terms of your initial question about narratives, for me, what is so crucial to highlight is the fact that renewables are often told as a story of inherent goodness, or like that they're inherently good. And what I would argue is actually it's more the way that the project is organized that makes the project good or bad. And so so rather than assuming the type of energy makes something good or bad, maybe we need to think about the type of project or how a project is managed, right? Like, because a project, it's not just because it's wind, it makes it good, right? That doesn't necessarily, if it's a wind project, it doesn't even necessarily mean that it's replacing carbon. If it's going to the Walmarts, it's increasing its production and, in another part of Mexico. So we need to so instead of trying to evaluate things in terms of in a moral register, particularly when it comes to energy, I think let's contextualize projects in places, and that allows us to then see them outside of our respective value systems, and then have a conversation together about them, about our futures.
All right, thank you very much, Stephanie.
I just wanted to highlight on the narrative side for policymakers, this is very important, because usually as a policymaker, you have to deal with the narrative and you have to create one, and according to which public you're going, you have to provide the right information at the right level, because you're not going to give the private sector, for example, the same information. It's not that you hide something, but you have to address it in a way that it's understandable for everyone. So you have different levels of narrative, but public information is the best way to convince people of a project, and having up front, what are the risks? What is the containment if there is a plan B, plan A, if there is a certain risk, what is the feasibility? What are the interest in real from stakeholders? So you have to, as a policymaker, you have to make this information public and make as public as you can the stakeholders analysis, and see as well who was invited at the table, because that can tell you mountains about the decision-making process and policy. So if you can see that only private sector was invited for the stakeholders meeting, then obviously this is a project that it's not going to have the real impacts from society in consideration. So that as a policymaker, I think it's very important to work in narratives at different levels as well.
Since you brought up the fact that Brazil is perhaps a very different animal than Paraguay with respect to their considerations with regards to the Itaipu Dam. I'll bring in a couple of questions from Ambassador Patrick Duddy of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies that might illuminate some of those differences. So he has two questions. One is that, given Brazil's pre-sal reserves, do you think hydropower is as important to Brazil as it used to be? And second, how supportive is the private sector now of renewable energy development in South America, given the relatively low price of oil and gas?
Ambassador Duddy continues to be sort of a great interlocutor, an expert on the ways that Latin America works. So thank you for these questions. So the first question, I want to sort of open up to thinking about so Brazil relies upon Itaipu a lot less than Paraguay does, even though Brazil uses more of Itaipu than Paraguay does. Brazil has a really complicated energy matrix, right? It has lots of hydroelectric dams. Some were still sort of mega dams were under construction in the northern part of the country that has been halted. There's been an explosion, maybe not explosion, effervescence of wind energy analysis, and particularly interest in the northern part of the country. And then of course, there's a considerable amount of petroleum that has been discovered, particularly offshore. And this changes what Brazil can do. And one of the things that's really important about Brazil's energy situation in general is that they're really good at planning. They are really good. They plan like 50 years, 70 years in advance. And this means that they are aware of, for example, in terms of Itaipu Dam, they're aware of the fact that they depend upon a lot of it, that Paraguay's half is something like 3 or 4% of the electricity that Brazil consumes, which is significant, particularly because it goes to its industrial centers. So already it's thinking about how do we need to get off, how do we wean ourselves off of the Paraguayan half of Itaipu? That's something that Brazilian energy experts obviously are modeling out. So I think it's not as important. So I think Itaipu is not as important, and I think hydro is not as important because Brazil is also sort of developing other aspects of its energy matrix. And so then the question of how supportive is the private sector of hydro or renewables in general, I think this is a really important question. It's not just because the price of oil is so cheap now, perhaps there's going to be more interest in thermal plants that burn fossil fuels. I think it's also that one of the main differences between something like a hydroelectric dam and something like, oil is how fast it takes to get it into a form that you can use it. So yeah, you have to build rigs, you have to move stuff to where the oil is, but you extract it, you process it, you can use it. Whereas something like a hydroelectric dam on the scale of an Itaipu or a 3 gorges in China, those things take decades to build, which means that there's a long time between the beginning of construction and actually energy generation, so that there's a long lag time between before you can actually start paying off your debt and start making profit or just revenue. And I don't think the private sector is interested in large mega projects because of this time lag. This goes to Stephanie's point about it's not just a one-size-fits-all, when is good, when is bad. It's like, what is the project like? Perhaps the private sector is more interested in smaller scale renewables. That would be the sort of the contrast rather than large scale hydro.
We are right up against time here, but there's a very good question at the end that I'd like to address, however briefly. It comes from Carlos, who asks, how would you objectively include socio-political variables in the design process for renewable energy projects? So I suppose, in other words, how do you make the design of energy systems sensitive to cultural and political variables?
Christine, do you have an answer?
Oh. I have ideas, but I've
yeah. Well, so I was just teaching at Wake Forest this spring, and one of the things that I noticed with our engineering students was a real desire to be able to design for these socio-political issues. When I really, I think it's more a way of thinking about social and cultural life and so it's really taking a lens of, let's not assume that we know what someone wants or desires and ask first, and kind of being open to asking questions and having assumptions that might change, which is challenging when you're trying to create a design which must be fixed at a particular moment in time and then put into the world, right? So socio-political situations are fluid, and power dynamics are changing, where projects are designed for a moment in time. So one practical suggestion I would offer would be to continue to value the socio-political landscape as much as one would value the physical and physics of the energy matrix that they're dealing with. So as much time as one would spend studying and maintaining a system that could be flexible to the physical environment, so too must we kind of be flexible to the socio-political environment that that energy systems are installed in. That would be my one way of addressing that specifically.
For me, from the political side, from the policy side, we can use statistical methods and economics methods for risk management. There's also two other methods that we usually use for, which is called sensitivity analysis, and another that it's called analytical hierarchy process. So we use different models to put the inputs that we have during a workshop or a stakeholder seminar. But it's very important as well to highlight that the stakeholders should be in different groups when you're talking about their perceptions, because you want the less powerful, in a sense, to be able to express fully and with all the confidence that this is not going to risk anything in his community. So there are methods that we can use to have some way to objectively measure perceptions and interest and measure the variables for the design process for renewable energy projects.
And I guess the other thing I would offer to this is that I think we need to have social scientists and experts in the more social cultural side actually as part of the project, not just sort of as sort of post-feasibility studies. They're actually part of the feasibility study, right, is the sociocultural and political angle, because the question of these projects is a question of sustainability, and sustainability is not just a question of river flow. It is a question of political stability, social acceptance, social commitment. And when you, so it actually materially and mechanically affects these projects. This is one of the reasons, if we have sustainable development, when sustainable development doesn't actually take into account fully social sustainability, the projects are not, they don't last. So I think it's partially that as well, to realize that the socio-cultural sustainability of a project is actually as fundamental in some ways as the river level or how regular the wind is. And so, okay, so I think we're out of time. I think Luana is going to close our time.
Thank you so much, our panelists, for spending time with us and talking about these projects. I want to also thank the audience for taking part. in the discussion. If you're interested in hearing about other virtual events like this one, please consider subscribing to our email or following us on social media if you don't already. Thanks again for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Yeah.